In the silence of this decay, it is hard to imagine the noise. The sheer, deafening roar of commerce that once occupied this space. This was not just a warehouse. This was the beating heart of the American economy. Before Amazon ever shipped a package, before Walmart ever opened a supercenter, there was a force so dominant, so omnipresent, that it defined how a nation lived, dressed, and dreamed. They were the first everything store. They built the tallest building in the world to house their ego. They owned insurance companies, real estate firms, and credit networks. They didn't just sell products, they sold a lifestyle. They were the original old money of the retail world. But empires do not die from murder, they die from suicide. They die from the slow, creeping poison of arrogance. Over the next hour, we will dissect the anatomy of a collapse. We will uncover how a company that had a 100-year head start finished last. This is the story of Sears, and it begins not in a boardroom, but with a mistake at a dusty railroad station. The year is 1886. The place is North Redwood, Minnesota. A young station agent named Richard Sears is bored. He is 22 years old, ambitious, and restless. Fate arrived on a train. A shipment of gold-filled pocket watches from a Chicago jeweler was refused by a local merchant. The merchant didn't want them. By law, they should have been returned. But Richard Sears saw something else. He saw a margin. He struck a deal with the wholesaler, bought the watches himself, and sold them to other station agents up and down the line. He made a profit of $5,000 in 6 months, a small fortune in those days. That accidental shipment taught Sears the most important lesson of his life. You don't need a store to sell. You need a network. But Richard was a hustler, not an operator. He needed someone to fix the watches that came back broken. He placed an ad in a Chicago newspaper. It was answered by a quiet, meticulous watch repairman named Alva Roebuck. It was the perfect partnership. Sears was the engine, Roebuck was the steering wheel. Together, they founded a company that would eventually carry both their names. But they weren't interested in just selling watches anymore. They had realized that the rural American farmer, the backbone of the country, was being exploited. In the late 19th century, if you lived in rural America, you were at the mercy of the local general store. Prices were high, selection was poor, and credit was tight. The general store owner was a local monopolist. Richard Sears declared war on this system. His weapon? A book. The Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog. It started as a flyer, but soon it grew into a monster. 500 pages, then 1,000. It was printed on cheap newsprint to save money, but to the isolated farm families of the Midwest, it was gold. They called it the Consumer's Bible. This book was the internet before the internet. It was Amazon, Google, and Netflix rolled into one. You could buy a fiddle, a tombstone, a rifle, a wedding dress, and even a kit to build your own house, all from the same book. Richard Sears was a copywriting genius. He wrote the descriptions himself, using language that was hypnotic, urgent, and personal. He created a concept that revolutionized retail. Satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. This was radical. In an era of buyer beware, Sears told the farmer, "Trust me." And they did. They trusted him with their savings. They trusted him with their dreams. By the turn of the century, the orders were not just trickling in, they were flooding in. The company was drowning in its own success. Richard Sears was a marketing genius, but he was a chaotic manager. Orders were lost. Warehouses were a mess. Enter Julius Rosenwald. If Sears was the visionary, Rosenwald was the architect. He bought into the company and brought order to the chaos. In 1906, they opened the Sears Merchandise Building in Chicago. It was the largest business building in the world, 5 million square feet of floor space. It was a marvel of the industrial age. Henry Ford is famous for the assembly line, but Sears perfected the fulfillment center decades before Amazon used robots. They used a system of pneumatic tubes and timing schedules so precise that a pair of shoes from the 3rd floor and a hammer from the 5th floor would arrive at the packing station at the exact same second. They were processing 100,000 orders a day. The United States Postal Service didn't just deliver for Sears, they effectively worked for Sears. By 1920, Sears was untouchable. They had democratized consumption. They had connected a fragmented nation through a network of rail and mail. Richard Sears retired a wealthy man, leaving behind a machine that printed money. But the world was turning. The automobile was arriving. People were no longer stuck on the farm. They were moving to the cities. The catalog, the very foundation of their empire, was about to face its first existential threat. Sears had conquered the mailbox. But could they conquer the street corner? The golden age was just beginning, but so were the seeds of their ultimate destruction. By 1920, America was changing shape. The isolated farm life that Richard Sears had built his empire upon was vanishing. The automobile had arrived. For the first time in history, the customer was mobile. They didn't have to wait weeks for a package to arrive by rail. They could drive to a city and buy it today. This terrified the old guard at Sears. Their entire infrastructure, millions of dollars in warehouses and printing presses, was built for a world that was disappearing. The catalog was still the consumer's Bible, but a new religion was forming, the department store. Sears needed a new prophet. They found him in a man who didn't care about retail at all. He cared about data. He cared about logistics. He was a military man. Chapter 4. The General's Gamble. Enter General Robert E. Wood. He was a quartermaster general during World War I and had helped build the Panama Canal. He understood the movement of massive amounts of material. But more importantly, he understood demographics. Wood looked at the census data of 1920 and saw a revelation. America was becoming urban. The farmers were moving to the factories. If Sears stayed only in the mailbox, they would die. He proposed a radical idea: build physical stores. Not in downtown Chicago or New York where the rents were high and the streets were crowded. No, build them on the edges of cities. Build them where the land was cheap. And most importantly, build them with massive parking lots. The board of directors was skeptical. Why cannibalize their own catalog business? But Wood insisted. In 1925, they opened a test store inside a mail-order plant in Chicago. It was an instant sensation. It wasn't just a store, it was a destination. The success was so violent, so immediate, that Wood ordered an aggressive expansion. By 1929, Sears had opened 300 stores. They weren't just a catalog company anymore. They were now the anchor of the American community. Chapter 5. The Fortress of Trust. Then, the sky fell. October 1929. The Great Depression. Wall Street crumbled. Banks locked their doors. The luxury department stores catered to the rich, and the rich were suddenly poor. But Sears was different. General Wood had positioned Sears not as a luxury brand, but as a utility. They sold tools to fix your own car. They sold fabric to sew your own clothes. They sold seeds to grow your own food. During the darkest economic decade in history, Sears didn't just survive, they solidified their legend. They launched their own private brands. Craftsman for tools, Kenmore for appliances, Allstate for insurance. These weren't just labels, they were promises. A Craftsman wrench came with a lifetime guarantee. If it broke, you brought it back, no questions asked. In a world where banks were failing and politicians were lying, Sears kept its word. They bought the loyalty of a generation, not with advertising, but with ironclad reliability. Chapter 6: The Suburban Explosion. 1945, the war ends. The soldiers come home, and America begins the greatest economic expansion in human history. The GI Bill gave millions of men mortgages. They moved to the suburbs. They bought houses. And what do you need when you buy a house? You need a refrigerator. You need a lawnmower. You need a washing machine. Sears was waiting. General Wood's gamble paid off 1,000 times over. Sears became the default setting for American life. They didn't just sell to the middle class, they created the middle class lifestyle. By the early 1950s, Sears accounted for 1% of the entire U.S. gross national product. Think about that. 1 out of every $100 spent in America went into a Sears cash register. They were bigger than their 4 largest competitors combined. They were establishing operations in Canada, Mexico, and South America. They were a sovereign state of commerce. Conclusion of Part 2. By the mid-century, Sears stood alone at the summit. They had navigated the transition from rural to urban, from catalog to retail, from war to peace. They were the undisputed kings of the hill. But heavy is the head that wears the crown. When you are that big, when you are that successful, you stop looking at the competition. You stop looking at the horizon. You start looking in the mirror. Sears had conquered the horizontal world, the land across America. Now, they wanted to conquer the vertical world. They were about to build a monument to their own greatness. And as history tells us, the Tower of Babel is usually built right before the fall. This part sets up the immense trust and scale Sears achieved. It makes the eventual fall much more tragic because we see how deeply embedded they were in American life. When you are ready, let me know, and I will provide Part 3, which will cover the construction of the Sears Tower, the peak of their arrogance, and the hidden rot beginning to form inside the corporate culture. By the 1960s, Sears was no longer just a company. It was an institution as permanent as the government and twice as trusted. 1 out of every 204 working Americans received a paycheck signed by Sears. They had conquered the mail. They had conquered the mall. They had moved the American family from the farm to the suburbs. But when you have conquered the earth, the only place left to look is the sky. This chapter is not about retail. It is about ego. It is about what happens when a company stops listening to its customers and starts listening to its own applause. Chapter 7: The Concrete God. In 1969, Sears made an announcement that shocked the world. They were going to consolidate their thousands of office workers into one single location. But not just any location. They commissioned the construction of the tallest building in human history, the Sears Tower. 110 stories of black aluminum and bronze-tinted glass. It was a masterpiece of engineering. It was a symbol of American dominance. But in hindsight, It was a tombstone. Before the tower, Sears executives worked in the cramped, noisy brick buildings on the west side of Chicago, right next to the merchandise. They could smell the tires and touch the fabric. They were connected to the product. But when they moved into the tower in 1973, they ascended into the clouds. The executives were now separated from the streets by 1,400 feet of steel. They literally looked down on the world. The culture shifted from merchant to aristocrat. The disconnect had begun. 25:00, 27:30, Chapter 8. The tragic year of 1962. While Sears was busy drawing blueprints for their skyscraper, a quiet revolution was happening on the ground. The year was 1962. It might be the most important year in retail history. In 1962, 3 new stores opened their doors for the first time. Kmart, Target, and a small, ugly discount store in Rogers, Arkansas, called Walmart. Sears didn't even blink. Why would they? Walmart was for poor people in rural towns. Kmart was cheap junk. Sears was the great American marketplace. They were selling diamonds and insurance. They felt they were in a different league. This arrogance was fatal. Sam Walton was studying Sears. He was copying their logistics but cutting their costs. He was building a machine designed to kill them. But in the Sears boardroom, the name Walmart wasn't even whispered. They were too busy buying stock brokerages. Chapter 9. Socks and Stocks. By the late 70s and early 80s, Sears had an identity crisis. They decided that selling clothes and tools wasn't enough. They wanted to manage your entire life. They bought Dean Witter Reynolds, a massive stock brokerage. They bought Coldwell Banker, a real estate giant. They launched the Discover card. The strategy was called Socks and Stocks. The idea was that a customer would come in to buy a pair of socks and leave with a new mortgage and a stock portfolio. It was a disaster. The American consumer didn't want to buy high-risk stocks from the same guy who sold them a lawnmower. The stores became confused. The aisles were cluttered with financial kiosks instead of merchandise. While Sears was trying to be a bank, their actual stores began to rot. The carpets got dirty. The lighting got dim. The service got slow. They were spending billions on Wall Street acquisitions while their own house was falling apart. As the 1980s dawned, the cracks in the foundation were invisible to the naked eye, but they were there. The tower stood tall, projecting strength. The revenue was still massive. The name was still gold. But the heart of the company, the obsession with the customer, had been left back in the old brick buildings on the west side. They had traded their soul for a skyscraper. And out in Arkansas, the man in the pickup truck was no longer just watching. He was coming. The 1990s, the decade that changed everything. The Cold War was over. The internet was waking up. Information was becoming the new oil. For a company like Sears, this should have been the golden age. They had the largest customer database on Earth. They had the most sophisticated logistics network in history. They had 100 years of data on what Americans bought, when they bought it, and how much they paid. They were Amazon before the internet existed. All they had to do was digitize the catalog. That's it. Just put the big book on a screen. But instead of embracing the future, Sears did something unthinkable. In a panic over short-term profits, they decided to murder their own history. Chapter 10. Killing the Big Book. January 25th, 1993. A date that should live in infamy in the business world. On this day, Sears announced they were discontinuing their famous Big Book catalog. For nearly a century, this book had been the soul of the company. It was the tool that built their empire. But the executives in the tower saw it differently. They saw it as a cost. It was expensive to print, expensive to mail, and the profits were shrinking. So, to save money, they killed it. They fired 50,000 workers connected to the catalog operations. They shut down the distribution centers.
The irony is suffocating. At the exact moment Sears was destroying the greatest direct-to-consumer infrastructure the world had ever seen, a young man named Jeff Bezos was driving across the country to start a bookstore in his garage. Bezos would later say that he didn't build Amazon from scratch. He built it on the infrastructure that others had laid down. Sears was that infrastructure. They handed the keys to the kingdom to a startup, and they didn't even know it. Chapter 11. The Prodigy Paradox. But the tragedy gets worse. It wasn't just ignorance. It was incompetence. You see, Sears actually owned the internet before Amazon. In the 1980s, they had partnered with IBM to create an online service called Prodigy. It was ahead of its time. People could shop, check news, and book flights from their home computers. Sears owned the platform that could have become Amazon, Google, and Facebook combined. But the retail executives at Sears hated it. They didn't understand it. They saw it as a distraction from selling shirts and screwdrivers. So, in the mid-90s, just as the internet boom was beginning, Sears sold their stake in Prodigy. They walked away from the digital revolution right before it exploded. They chose the past over the future. Again.
By the late 90s, the socks and stocks strategy had failed. The shareholders were angry. The stock was stagnant. Walmart was devouring their market share in the suburbs, and Target was stealing the young shoppers. Desperate for cash, Sears began to sell the family silver. They spun off Allstate Insurance. They sold Coldwell Banker. They sold Dean Witter. They even sold the Sears Tower itself. They stripped the company down to its core, the retail stores. The problem was, the retail stores were dying. They were dark, understaffed, and confusing. They launched a campaign called The Softer Side of Sears. It was a brilliant marketing move that briefly boosted sales of clothing. But marketing cannot fix a broken product. You can put lipstick on a corpse, but it is still a corpse. Conclusion of Part 4. As the new millennium dawned, Sears was a ship without a rudder. They had no catalog. They had no internet strategy. They had no identity. They were just a big building in a mall that people walked through to get to the parking lot. They needed a savior. They needed a hero. What they got was a hedge fund manager. In 2005, a merger was announced that was promised to be the savior of retail. Kmart and Sears would join forces. The media called it a powerhouse. History would call it a death pact. In 2005, the merger of Kmart and Sears created the third largest retailer in the United States. It was an $11 billion deal. The man who orchestrated it, Eddie Lampert, was hailed as a genius. Wall Street loved him. They thought he would use his financial wizardry to reinvent the department store. But they were wrong. Eddie Lampert wasn't a merchant. He wasn't a builder. He was a dismantler. He rarely visited the stores. He didn't even live in Chicago, where the headquarters were. He managed this empire from a mansion on an exclusive island in Florida, staring at spreadsheets, completely disconnected from the reality of the sales floor. To him, Sears wasn't a store. It was a piggy bank, and he was about to smash it open. Chapter 13. The Hunger Games. Lampert was a devotee of the philosopher Ayn Rand. He believed that selfishness was a virtue and that absolute competition created the best results. So he turned Sears into a battlefield. He split the company into 30 different divisions: appliances, clothing, tools, and made them compete against each other for money. It was a corporate version of the Hunger Games. Instead of working together to fight Amazon or Walmart, the appliance department was fighting the clothing department. They stopped sharing data. They stopped helping each other. They even charged each other fees for advertising in the weekly circular. The result was civil war. The company cannibalized itself from the inside out. While Amazon was building a seamless ecosystem, Sears was building walls between its own employees. The culture became toxic. The best talent left. And the customers? They were forgotten in the crossfire. While the executives fought in the boardroom, the stores began to rot. Literally, Lampert stopped investing in maintenance. He believed that fixing a roof or painting a wall didn't generate a return on investment. So, he let them crumble. Shoppers would walk into a Sears and see buckets catching rainwater. They would see understaffed checkout lines stretching for miles. They would see merchandise thrown on the floor. It felt like walking into a graveyard. By 2010, retail had become about experience. Apple was building temples of glass and light. Sears was looking like a Soviet-era grocery store. Lampert argued that he was being disciplined with capital, but the customers saw it for what it was: disrespect. And once a customer feels disrespected, they never come back. Chapter 15: Selling the Family Jewels. As the sales plummeted, the cash dried up. To keep the lights on, Sears began to sell its organs. First, they spun off Land's End. Then, in a heartbreaking move, they sold the legendary Craftsman tool brand to Black & Decker for $900 million. Craftsman was the soul of Sears. It was the reason grandfathers took their grandsons to the store. Selling it was the final admission of defeat. It was like selling your wedding ring to pay the rent. But the biggest asset sale was the land itself. Lampert created a real estate investment trust called Seritage. He sold hundreds of the best Sears properties to this new company, which he also controlled, and then rented the stores back to Sears. Critics called it stripping the carcass. The money was moving from the left pocket to the right pocket, while the store in the middle starved to death. Conclusion of Part 5. By 2017, the end was no longer a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. The company was losing billions of dollars a year. The suppliers stopped shipping products because they were afraid they wouldn't get paid. The shelves were bare. The once mighty titan was now a zombie, shuffling forward, waiting for someone to put it out of its misery. The final hour had arrived. Note, this part is heavy on emotion and frustration. It paints Eddie Lampert as the villain who misunderstood the soul of the company. Are you ready for the final chapter? Part 6 will cover the 2018 bankruptcy, the bulldozing of the headquarters, and the final lesson we must learn from this tragedy. October 15th, 2018. On a cold Monday morning, lawyers walked into a federal court in New York and filed a petition for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The document was hundreds of pages long, but it really said only one thing: we failed. The company listed $11.3 billion in debt. The giant that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the dot-com bubble had finally succumbed to its own cancer. It wasn't a murder. It was a slow, painful suicide that took 20 years to complete. Chapter 16: Everything Must Go. The liquidation sales began immediately. It was a funeral procession disguised as a clearance event. Everything must go. Nothing held back. For the employees, many of whom had given 30 or 40 years of their lives to the company, it was a tragedy. They watched as the walls were stripped bare. They watched as vultures came to pick the bones of the store they loved. There were no severance packages for the hourly workers. The pension fund was underfunded. While the executives walked away with bonuses, the people who built the company walked away with nothing but memories. One by one, the lights went out across America. The malls that Sears had anchored for decades suddenly felt empty. When the anchor sinks, the ship goes down with it. The death of Sears triggered the death of hundreds of malls across the country. It was an economic winter. Today, the sprawling headquarters in Illinois stands like a monument to a lost civilization. It was built to house thousands of dreamers. Now, it echoes with silence. A few zombie stores remain, limping along under new ownership, but the soul of the company is gone. The name Sears no longer means trust. It no longer means the American dream. It is now a case study in business schools, a warning label on the bottle of success. Conclusion, the final lesson. So what killed the Titan? It wasn't Amazon. It wasn't Walmart. It wasn't the internet. Sears died because it fell in love with its past and ignored its future. They had the money, they had the data, and they had the customers' trust. But they lacked the humility to change. Old money is a dangerous thing. It convinces you that you are invincible. It whispers that tomorrow will be just like yesterday. But in business, as in life, the only constant is change. Let this empty parking lot be a lesson to you. It doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how much money you have. If you stop innovating, if you stop listening to your customers, if you stop looking at the horizon, you will become a ghost. Build your empire, but never, ever get comfortable, because the wind is always blowing, and it can blow you away just as easily as it brought you here.